Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello. Now, goodness, it's been a confusing week. This woman kept saying a change is gonna come, thus channeling this man, the late great Sam Cooke, and turning true blue Tory conference into something of a nostalgia fest for the Black American civil rights movement. Except that this woman, Amber Rudd, didn't get the equal ops memo when she announced that companies would be forced to disclose how many foreigners they employ. He clearly did, when announcing the most ethnically and genderly, is that a word? Diverse shadow cabinet in history. But in denying MPs the vote on who's in his top team, he alienated Rosie Winterton and sacked her as his chief whip, which miffed the MPs who haven't taken a job from him. And goodness only knows what's been going on in his party. Phew, Allegra.
OK, so there's 1 month to go until America goes to the polls, and it's the US elections dominating our papers this morning. Might the Republicans dump Trump? Probably not, but he's in a lot of trouble. Look at the Sunday Telegraph. They're saying it's a Trump crisis after sex comments caught on tape. Over the last 24 hours, former Republican presidential candidate John McCain has dumped Trump. So have other key party figures like Mitt Romney. And then this from Jeb Bush. Of course, he was running for the race himself once, and now he's saying on Twitter, "As the grandfather of two precious girls, I find no apology can excuse away Donald Trump's reprehensible comments degrading women." But for the Donald, all is not lost, because Nigel Farage, our very own Nigel Farage, is stateside, and yesterday he told Fox News, you know what? Donald Trump's not running to be Pope. No, that's next. Anyway, now back here, Theresa May's government is actually being accused of being worse than Trump. This is by former Cameron advisor Steve Hilton. I'll just get up the piece he's written for the Sunday Times. It's incredibly brutal. If you haven't read it, it's worth a read. He doesn't hold back. And in particular, he's attacking the foreign worker register that Robert mentioned. He's saying it is repugnant. Now, the problem is, people who don't like it, like Steve Hilton, they are actually out of touch with the country. Just let me show this polling that was done last week. It shows you that almost everybody of any political persuasion supports it. Look, UKIP here, Conservatives, then Labour, but then less obviously Lib Dems, and then the SNP are evenly split. Now, elsewhere in Steve Hilton's piece, he says that Theresa May is getting Brexit exactly wrong. So we want to know, out there, if you voted for Brexit, are you happy with Theresa May's version of it? Tweet in and let us know. Robert.
So in a minute, I'll be talking to the woman with perhaps the toughest job in Theresa May's cabinet. That's the Education Secretary, Justine Greening. But first, I'm delighted to be joined by Sir Craig Oliver and by Alistair Campbell, two masters of the dark arts. If this was Harry Potter, the world would probably be about to come to an end. But if I could just start, I mean, Trump is obviously the big story of the moment. If you were advising Trump, is there any way out of this for him?
I would advise him to vote Hillary. I couldn't advise Trump. I find him beyond anything that I would want to be in the same room as on so many levels. My only worry, I mean, I do think this might be the tipping point. I think we've seen so much really bad stuff coming out of Trump's words and deeds. And I think this might be the tipping point. My only worry is still that a little bit with like with the Brexit debate, where people felt those on my side, our side of the argument, thought we had the arguments, thought we were winning the arguments, but there came a point where people stopped listening. And I do worry still about America, that the fact that he's got as far as he has worries me, that there are enough people out there just to say we're going to give the establishment, i.e. Hillary, a kicking. I think Hillary will win. Even his apology was awful. So I don't know. I think Trump is hopefully in a very, very big mess, and the more he digs, the better it will be. The debate in the early hours is going to be incredibly important.
Craig, as somebody who was advising the Prime Minister until quite recently, if a British cabinet minister was reported to have made these remarks, they'd have gone by now, wouldn't they?
Yeah, if it was a cabinet minister, they'd be gone. I think what's really...
So why do you think Trump survived so far,
because he's the official Republican candidate. And it's very rare in politics to see a blow that actually knocks somebody and puts them on the canvas. Whether he gets up or not, very interesting. I think the serious problem for him is conservatives around the world like to vote for people who are respectable. And there is part of the Republican Party who will look at him and say he is not respectable. And you're seeing that with McCain coming forward now and others saying that. And I think a lot of them may very well sit on their hands, which will probably prove fatal for him.
Now, you're right that the Republican establishment is turning against him, but we saw in our own Brexit vote that there are just millions of people who are very, very angry, want to give the establishment a bloody nose. So do you, in your heart and brain, think that Trump is out, as it were, that he can't win?
I mean, look, it's possible that he could do it. I suspect he won't, but I think it is possible. I was in New York recently and watching at the moment where Hillary collapsed in the pneumonia thing, and you could see her team wanting to cover that over. Naturally, their reaction was to want to cover that up. And you could see and feel in America quite how annoyed people were with the establishment and with her. She is not a popular candidate, but I think Trump has done something which is so far beyond the pale now, or has been seen to do something so far beyond the pale, I suspect it'll work.
Look, we've got a lot to talk about. We'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. I'm now absolutely delighted to be joined for my big interview by Justine Greening, the Education Secretary. Very nice to see
Robert, how are you?
Justine. Well, thank you. So, you'll forgive me, I'm going to start with grammar schools. And I am a bit confused about the policy. By that, what I mean is, on the one hand, you had Theresa May at the Tory party conference making a huge thing of giving permission for the opening of new grammar schools. But also, I've heard her say, and you say, that actually there aren't going to be all that many of them, you don't think. And they aren't going to transform the education system. So which is it? Is it a big policy or is it a trivial, rather symbolic policy?
Well, it's about giving parents choice, and it's about responding to the fact that we need more good school places, particularly in parts of the country where we don't have enough already. And fundamentally, particularly for children on free school meals who go to grammars, their progress is at twice as fast a rate as their better-off classmates. So grammars for them are closing the attainment gap. So this is also about saying, how can we make sure that grammar schools are more open for those disadvantaged children so that they can really turbocharge their education, but also
challenging... Do you have an idea yet of how many you think we're likely to see over the next 5 years being opened? And
also challenging grammars to do more to lift up other schools in their local area.
But in terms of
the numbers, Robert, that's going to be up to local communities. So what we want to do is...
Do you think the numbers could be doubled over 5 years, for example?
It's very much going to be down to local communities what they
Would you like to see a doubling in the numbers over 5 years?
I want to see parents have more choice. So we think it's wrong at the moment that in this particular part of the education system, whilst there's so much more additional choice that's come into play over recent years, grammars have really been put on one side. We want to have a 21st century education system, but that means that we have to look at what the role grammars can play will be as well. And we do want to make sure that parents have choice, and we know that in many parts of the country where grammars are, that the places are massively oversubscribed. We want to respond to that. We've put out these points in a consultation. It's running till December, and then at that stage, yes, we'll get a clearer sense of what people's views and attitudes are.
Now, one of the things that you've said, and I'm pretty sure the Prime Minister has said as well, is that we're not going back to a so-called binary system, where it's literally a choice of, in the old days it was secondary moderns and grammars, and now comprehensives and grammars. Obviously, there are some who think that those comprehensive standards in those could fall if we went back to that kind of choice. But most parents, surely, if given the opportunity, would want a more academic education for their kids. So how can you guarantee that we won't go back to a binary system? How can you guarantee that, frankly, there just won't be massive demand for grammar schools?
Well, this is absolutely not about a return to the 11+, and one of the many areas we're consulting on is whether children should be able to go into selective schools at different ages rather than just at 11.
So there could be lots and lots of them, but then you would just keep the door open for those kids who show promise at a later age.
We have to understand that children develop at different paces, and so our education system needs to reflect that. But the other point I...
But it does sort of imply that you think it is possible we could go back to a world in which there were 20-25% of schools that are grammar schools.
As I said, it's what we're going to do is give parents the choice that they don't have today. But we should also recognise that, particularly over the last 5-10 years, the school system's changed beyond all recognition. There's the rise of academies and free schools means there's much more choice for parents now than ever before. So this sense that we're living in some kind of binary education world that we had back in the 1950s and 60s couldn't be further from the truth. But it is time to now make sure that the role that grammars play is a strong one, that we make sure that grammar schools really are open to the most disadvantaged children. We look at the test and make sure that it's one that is as least possible to be tutored for as possible. And we want to see grammars, as I said, play their role in lifting up other schools. If you look at parts of the country like London, where we've really seen education attainment improve, a lot of that's been driven by teachers and head teachers leading schools that were good, but partnering up with schools that could do better. And that's what we want to see grammars play a much stronger role in doing too.
Now, another part of your educational reforms is to encourage more faith schools. Some of those faiths are very explicitly opposed to gay marriage. You recently came out and said you're in a gay relationship. Are you worried about the cultural impact of encouraging faith schools, particularly if it encourages more prejudice against gay people?
Well, first of all, in terms of, again, what we were consulting on is, at the moment, if a free school opens, there's this so-called 50% rule, and that really says that if the school's oversubscribed, then it can only allocate 50% of its places based on faith. The problem is that in practice, often these free schools are not oversubscribed, so the rule doesn't kick in, and as a result, we have seen faith schools, often with well over 90% of their intake on one faith.
I understand that, but you haven't actually addressed that cultural issue.
But let me just explain what we're
to
consulting on, because I think it's important to set that out. So what we're asking is, what would be smarter rules to make sure that schools are going to be proper community schools where parents from with children of no faith or different faiths will want to go. And in terms of my own tweet that I did just after the referendum, I think it is important that schools demonstrate that we live in a country where there's equality on lots of different levels, not just in terms of people's relationships, but on gender as well. And I want to look very carefully at how we can make sure that sex and relationship education is really fit for the world that children growing up in today, not perhaps the world that they were growing up in during the 1990s.
Now, obviously, the biggest issue of all at the moment is Brexit. You were on the Remain side. In your view, is access to the single market of the sort that we've been enjoying now off the table?
I don't think anything's off the table, actually. We're about to embark on a historic negotiation for Britain. The Prime Minister's set out that we'll have triggered Article 50 by the end of March next year. That will give us the remaining time that we need to work out our game plan, and then we will be into a negotiation. And we need to have the flexibility within that to be able to get the very best deal for Britain. But I think principally we'll want to recognise two things. One is that in the European Union referendum, where people voted to leave the EU, what underpinned that was a real concern about a lack of control we have had for many years on our immigration system. We need to respond to that, and people will expect us, quite rightly, to look forward to how we can have a migration system that really works for our country and for the people in our country. At the same time, we absolutely want to make sure that our economy continues to have strong fundamentals, and that British business can continue to trade effectively both inside Europe and with Europe. So we need to make sure that over the coming 2 years of the negotiation that gets kicked off after March next year, that we strike the right balance between those two things. But it is important that we respond to the clear concerns that people were raising as part of the referendum vote on migration.
Yes, well, you've mentioned migration. How comfortable were you personally by Amber Rudd's disclosure that you want to force companies to say how many foreigners they employ?
Well, this gives me a good chance to say that that is really about collecting the right evidence that we will need if we're going to be able to respond to skills shortages of employers and to really understand
But aren't
how...
you worried that companies feel they will be named and shamed if they employ more than a tiny number of foreigners?
And I'm pleased you mentioned that, because this is not data that will be published. There will be absolutely no naming and shaming.
Oh, so just to be absolutely clear, this is going to be confidential data for government. This will not be published.
Correct. This is about informing policy so that we understand particularly which areas and parts of the country there are skill shortages, evidenced by the fact that employers are not taking local workers as much as they might do, and it then enables us really to tailor policy in those areas so that we can respond to that and make sure that people can take advantage of the opportunities economically in their area.
Why didn't Amber Rudd say that at the time?
Well, I'm saying it absolutely clearly now, and the consultation will be coming out shortly that makes that clear too. But I think we're not going to get smart policy if we don't have the right evidence to be able to drive it, and that's what this is all about. And I launched a policy on opportunity areas at conference earlier last week, which is all about saying in areas where there's lower educational attainment than we want to see, and particularly where there are fewer jobs and job prospects for people, we need to look at that in the round rather than just having macro policies at the national level. We now need to really look at how we can tailor making a difference on the ground for people, and that's what Amber was talking about as well, looking at the kind of data we want to collect from companies so that we can have a smarter approach to that.
Welcome back. The Education Secretary wanted to go home, but I gave her lines and detention, so she is still here. But first, Allegra, what have the viewers learned from the nation's head teacher?
So there's a couple of interesting conversations going on out there. The first is from Porritt. He wants you to ask the following question to Justine, which is, if kids can join new grammar schools post-11, does that mean pupils already there might be kicked out? He thinks the policy's full of holes. But then, what for me was most interesting, picked up by our ITV colleague Paul Brand, did Justine Greening just announce a U-turn on immigration? Companies won't have to announce how many foreign workers they employ. Certainly, I think her language just then was softer than we've heard before. And in fact, if this policy had been put to the Commons to a vote, it's not certain anymore that they would have got it through. They do have quite a serious party management issue at the moment, even though to the outside eye, UKIP's heir apparent is hospitalised and Labour is holed up in a fortress in Islington. Nonetheless, there are rebellions aplenty on the horizon. You've got grammar schools, firstly. This is possibly going to see 20 to 30 Conservative MPs rebelling against, Nicky Morgan being the figurehead for that one. If you add in the SNP and Labour opposing it, unless Theresa May compromises, this could be her first defeat. Next up on the horizon, we're calling it the Great Reform Act. It's not. That was in 1832. Instead, it's the Great Repeal Act. And this is coming in the spring. And we've heard from our friend Anna Soubry. She said on our programme last week that she possibly could vote against it. Lots of MPs would vote against it. Would it get through? And then this other one, Heathrow Airport. We think up to 20 Tory MPs could vote against this one. The figureheads this time would be Boris Johnson and our guest Justine. They'd be joined by about 20 Tory MPs. Surely that one, at least, has to be a free vote on the Tory side. Otherwise, would Justine Greening have to resign? Robert.
Thanks. Well, I think others can decide whether this was a clarification or a U-turn, but you were completely explicit that companies will have to gather the data on foreign workers, but the only people who will see it are ministers and civil servants. The public won't see it. That's right, isn't it?
That's right, and I don't think Amber ever said that it would have to be published, so...
Anyway, let's judge that after the programme, as it were. But there is another issue related to immigration that is pretty hot at the moment, which is what... In fact, you, I think, as well as she said, about foreign students coming to the UK. And you said broadly that there will be a clampdown on foreign students wanting to do lower quality courses. But I wasn't quite clear what you meant by that. Perhaps you could have just explained a little bit more about what you meant.
Well, the Home Secretary was setting out that we'll be looking at a range of issues and a range of areas where we've seen migration driven. Part of that is people coming here to work, but another part, of course, is people coming here to study. And I think responding to the Brexit vote means that we really have to look at all the areas to make sure we've got an overall migration strategy that really works for our country. But that does also include universities. And I think what will what we'll be taking is a very measured, proportionate look at how we can make sure we
What of our
have a
great
world-class
exports?
university
One of our
system,
great exports
but
is
also
education,
one
particularly higher
that means that
education.
people can come here to study, but we have some stronger controls over who's doing that.
But do you really believe that there are lots of, in a sense, sham degrees being handed out? Because surely the only justification for doing this is if you think that many of these universities are not providing proper courses.
I don't think really that's at the heart of it. I think it's just saying that if we really are going to have a reformed migration system, which we now have the chance to do because we are leaving the EU, we want to look in the round across all of that. And over the last 6 years as Home Secretary, Theresa May took a series of steps to tighten up the system, including closing bogus colleges. But we hadn't got to the end of that process, and it's just simply the case that it would be wrong not to look at the different levers that we can pull that will make a difference, and that's what Amber Rudd,
And you're
as Home Secretary now, is setting that out.
You're completely comfortable with that approach?
I think it's really important that we work with the university sector. It's one of the key sectors that's going to help us be successful when we've left Brexit. I think we should be very proud of the fact that, for example, Oxford University topped the list of the university rankings this year. But at the same time, we need to recognise that we have a lot of overseas students. Some of them are overstayers, and it's right that we look at how we make sure the system is suitably tightened up.
Now, we're quite tight for time. 2 or 3 quick things. Heathrow, Chris Grayling signalled when he was on our programme last week, I thought that the government would be going for Heathrow, third runway. You're on the record as opposing a third runway. If it is a third runway, what will you do?
Well, I've spent more time in business than I have in politics in my career so far, but during the time in politics, I've learnt not to particularly answer hypothetical questions about decisions that haven't been taken and on timelines that we don't know really what they'll be. But as you say, Robert, everybody knows my views on Heathrow.
Free vote, would that answer your concerns?
Who knows if there'll be a free vote? So again, there's no point.
But obviously it sounds as though you think it's
track.
theoretically possible there'll be a free vote.
I don't know. We'll all have to wait and see.
Another Brexit-related issue, again in your patch, is this question of whether those without British passports can advise the government on Brexit. Where do you stand on that?
Well, again, there's been no change on the policy, so I'm pleased you raised it, because there's absolutely no change on the policy. I'm not really sure why
what does that mean then? So in other words,
well, because in terms of
so the Foreign Office will be able to go to Germans or French academics working here and ask them for advice on Brexit.
And they always have been able to, and we would always have the necessary security checks, and those are continuing as they always have done. So there's been no change.
So you're reassuring the LSE, for example, who seem to be particularly exercised about this, that actually their brilliant academics can continue to work for the government?
Absolutely, and there's been no
on
change.
Brexit.
There's been no change in the policy, and we'd always, of course, have the necessary security checks to make sure that we were engaging people in the right way. But there's been no change in the policy, so I'm pleased you've raised it because it gives me the chance to clarify that.
And finally, huge reports about splits between Philip Hammond on the one hand, Liam Fox, David Davis on the other. Do you think the Cabinet will be able to survive in its current form as and when the Brexit decisions are taken?
Yes, I think so. I think it's important that our party has come together under the leadership of Theresa May to now steer our country through what will be historic months and years ahead. I can't think of anyone better, frankly, to be getting off the Eurostar heading in Brussels and getting a great deal for us. But I think the Cabinet is united, and that's important because we've got an incredibly difficult, challenging job ahead of us, and we need to make sure we deliver for our country and our people.
And the remarks by Donald Trump. Could you conceive, if you hadn't had a vote in America, of voting for him?
Well, as a woman, I felt they were utterly crass. Obviously, it's up to the American people to decide whether they think that he's the right person to be their president.
Justine Greening, lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Many thanks. So, lot to chew over there with Alistair Campbell and Craig Oliver. I thought that was actually quite a big shift by Justine Greening. I think some would call it something of a...
On the Amber Rudd?
Yeah.
I think it probably was. I mean, I got the feeling that Justine Greening there was womanfully defending a lot of policies with which she doesn't have that much sympathy. I think that there are more Conservatives around who think this grammar school policy is complete madness than we might get the impression of. And also, I think that on Brexit, I think that even though Amber Rudd acted as she did at the conference and Jeremy Hunt came up with that nonsense about, you know, we just sort out the NHS by stopping getting a few more British doctors, I think there are more people in the cabinet and inside the Conservative Party who think that this hard Brexit, so-called, is a complete and total disaster. And I think that part of what's happened is that last week there was a shift towards this hard Brexit. I think Theresa May played into that. And I think once Parliament comes back and once the cabinet gets back into gear, I think that Philip Hammond will be trying to press for something far more reasonable and far less ridiculous than some of the nonsense that we heard last week, including, may I say, I think there will be a push towards this idea that when this whole vote was about parliamentary sovereignty and now Parliament's going to have nothing to do with it is complete nonsense. So I think there's a vacuum opening up in British politics with Labour going off that direction, the Tories going off in that direction, and on this future of Britain's role within the European Union, I think there is a big debate to be had about what this vote actually meant, and we're not even yet having it.
Craig, were you surprised when you heard Amber Rudd? And it was explicit. I mean, I was there, and I had the briefings, as it were. The briefings were that companies would publish this data on how many foreigners.
I was a little surprised. What I think happened was that the government dipped its toe in the water and found it was scalding hot. And I think what you've seen since then is a sort of managed retreat. So they talked about it being a consultation afterwards, which is actually government speak for we don't intend to do what you think we're going to do. And then I think what you've just heard there is, well, actually it'll all be in private. So I think that they started from a position of testing things out, seeing if it worked. They discovered that business was shrieking, and then we've seen what Steve Hilton said today. And I think they're slowly withdrawing from it.
Business is shrieking about a lot that they said and did last week. And I really do think that I think there's a sense of Theresa May is trying to turn this referendum into a kind of general election where she can now do what the hell she wants about whatever policy she approaches. We've seen so many, the grammar schools things, they have no mandate. Actually, your manifesto that your boss got a majority on, I think there was an explicit commitment to stay in the single market. That now appears to be going out of the window. So I really do think that there's...
I think you're seeing two great truths in British politics at the moment. One, it's become clear over the last few days the extent to which the whole bandwidth of government almost will be taken up by Brexit. And secondly, Jeremy Corbyn is leader of the opposition, and while that is happening, a Conservative Prime Minister is facing the most benign conditions that she possibly could.
Lots more to chew over in just a second. We're just going to hear a little bit more from Allegra.
So as you've heard from our friends, the Spin Twins over there, there's a huge amount of action on the Brexit game. And in particular, there's a huge amount of action on a gem that we haven't touched very much before, the single market. Now, whereas we've heard silence for months on this issue, this week we actually got some clarity from the government that they would be prepared to leave the single market. Now, first of all, just let me show you here this tweet. HSBC, the bank, saying sterling is now the de facto official opposition to the UK government. Why did they say that? Well, take a look at what has happened to sterling over the last week, and you can quite closely correlate it with what the government's been saying. First of all, this is exactly a week ago, Theresa May saying last Sunday that she could take Britain out of the single market, known as the hard Brexit. The pound plunged on Monday. Then, a little bit further in the week, but on Thursday, another big plunge, or a flash crash as it's known. This is when François Hollande says that actually the EU has to be really tough on the UK in negotiations. Business is very, very jittery. Even though there was a slight rally, it's still worried, and that is causing the Chancellor to be very worried. And we learned from the papers this morning that inside Cabinet, the chief Brexiteers fear he is being far too worried, too gloomy. He needs to be more optimistic about Brexit. Robert.
That tweet, as said, sterling is now the official opposition, spoke to a truth, which is that Labour is just nowhere in the Brexit debate. Do you see, with, for example, the changes to the shadow cabinet, Keir Starmer now the opposite number to David Davis, do you think Labour can start to become a proper opposition? Well,
I hope so, and I do think that Labour, both during the referendum and since the referendum, have been almost not on the pitch. And I hope that Keir Starmer resets the button, for a start. I hope he...
And what should Labour's position be?
I think Labour's position has to... I think the whole political class has fallen far too quickly for this idea. Brexit means Brexit. Fair enough, you have to say we accept the verdict of the public. What you don't say is that we now say Theresa May has a mandate to do whatever the hell she wants. And she's saying no running commentary. There has got to be a running scrutiny, and I hope that Keir Starmer, the Lib Dems, the SNP, Tory Remainers, Tory Leavers, frankly, some of whom are getting very worried, they've got to step up to the mark and understand this has now got to be fought in Parliament.
Craig, you were at the forefront of the Remain campaign. It's what your book is about. We're going to maybe talk about both of your books in a minute or two.
Quite right.
But she, the Prime Minister, constantly says that Brexit means controls on immigration, no more imposition of law from Brussels. Is that, in your view, what Brexit... And no more budget contributions, of course. Do you think that is explicitly what people voted for when they voted for Brexit? Or do you think the position is actually rather more nuanced than that?
I mean, I think it is, of course, much more nuanced than that. And I think what we're seeing is we had this sort of slightly strange honeymoon period where everybody was saying, well, look, the sky is still blue, the glass is still green, the world is still turning, everything is fine. And I think what's been really interesting about the last few days is you've suddenly seen what happens when the irresistible force of people who want hard Brexit, a complete end to freedom of movement, has come up against the reality of the markets, the reality of business, the reality of people saying, we're confused, we don't understand. And of course, that is going to be the great tension of Theresa May's government. That is going to be the difficulty for her.